Excellent. So, hello and welcome, everybody. As the title of my talk says, this is Confessions of a Recovering Humanist, so I thought I wanted to start this talk with an actual confession. So know, dear listener, that I too once was a young humanities scholar, taught by my mentors that were not as handsome as Sean Connery, but quite as old and wise, that all possible knowledge in the world is already contained in the bellies of the library. To venture into the world outside this library was to flirt with temptation and even eternal damnation of your soul, because out there were people that our texts referred to, and people that actually read the texts, and people that actually wrote the texts. But you must never speak to this people. No. For the meaning of the texts are never revealed by the people. They're only ever revealed by other texts in the library. That is what my mentors and their texts in this case taught me, which is when I was doing a comparative literature degree back in the late 90s and early 2000s in Germany at the University of Münster, which was kind of the height of post-structuralist, postmodernist theory. Comparative literature is very much literary theory, relatively classical. So there were kind of these pockets of weird stuff called empirical literary science, but thou shalt not talk about these things. So going outside the library, speaking to authors, speaking to readers, observing them, or any such thing was just a big no-no. So I felt very lost and alone in this kind of methodological prison house of language because of this kind of fear or unease of accessing any kind of data form or any kind of method that would take you outside of there in order to settle or move forward any kind of argument, and therefore the only thing that you could ever do is continue the argument based on other books that other people have washed into the library, which I thought was pretty bonkers. I still think is pretty bonkers as a kind of a methodological constraint. So as a result, I got very frustrated and I just wanted to burn it all down. And I left the library and I left comparative literature and ventured out into the world outside its icy confines for the past 15 years. Specifically, I ventured out into industry, in digital design, designing games, web applications, and software applications, working with artists, managers, software developers, advertisers, user researchers, and the actual people using the applications. And in research, I ventured into other fields studying exactly these kind of things, where I got into contact with people in communication research, psychology, human-computer interaction, computer science, the lot. So lots of different things that don't necessarily consider themselves literary studies, let alone the humanities. But now, today, 2019, 15 years later, I look back at those years back there in the library in comparative literature, and I notice that I'm increasingly looking back at that with a kind of fondness, where I've realized that there are some unexpected things that education and that experience has taught me that I'm drawing on day by day by day in unexpected ways that are actually quite valuable. And that is what I want to share with you today, these kind of unexpected lessons learned. 3 of them, lots of different ones that I could additionally get into, but 3 of them. But before I say that, the obvious caveat is this is an N of 1, this is comparative literature, so your mileage may vary, right? I'm not claiming to speak for archaeology, not claiming to speak for music or anything else. This is that particular experience. But on with the lessons. So the first lesson that I took away is a weird license to poach in any and all other fields. A sort of chutzpah, audacity, or daring that you can go out into the world and just read everything and anything as long as it is related to your topic or it is context to your topic, which on the one hand you could say, of course, is very arrogant because economics, biology, psychology, computational social science, very complex field. They very much have their own languages. There is very much a lot of initial knowledge you need to know in order to literally make sense of these different texts. So the idea that you can just pick up one of them and make sense of them is to some extent quite arrogant. On the other hand, literature like history gives you this wonderful license that, in fact, on a very pragmatic level, it's all just text. These are all just texts that you can read as text and deal with them as texts. And apart from the textual analysis, so if you want to do a formal or rhetorical analysis of how a mathematics paper works, it's also interesting. But apart from that kind of formal analysis, I noticed that this principal license to poach intellectually gave me something different. Now, most empirical disciplines that I've encountered, again, psychology or or health sciences these days, are very much built on the idea of systematicity. There's a systematic body of knowledge. There's a particular domain or aspect of reality over which we have very particular theories and with which very particular methods we generate data that then falsifies or corroborates these theories and moves them forward. And to that extent, to venture out of that, so to venture out of this structured, systematic body of knowledge is weird because you don't have any ready way to make sense of that. So if you're interested in a psychological topic around leadership, and then suddenly you go into the organizational management literature that looks at that from a sociological lens, you suddenly know, I have no idea how to make sense of this necessarily, and so therefore you find very little venturing outside your own disciplines. And humanities disciplines definitely can be like that, and I've definitely encountered some where you're very much limited to your own canon of methods and theories, etc. But in principle, at least in comparative literature, this license, it's all just text and it's all context for your topic, had sort of implicitly in it this license to be multi and interdisciplinary from the get-go. So to give an example, one of the things that I'm encountering in designing games for a serious purpose is embarrassment as an emotion. And one of the findings in our field is that feeling embarrassed or being afraid of embarrassing yourself is what keeps people from engaging with so-called serious or applied games. So games we design in order to motivate health behavior, in order to learn in a more fun and engaging way, these kind of things. So to give a practical example, this is my colleague Chad Toprak at RMIT in Melbourne, and they designed this exercise game, which is basically motivating you to do pull-ups. So you have this little projection here of a float and water. As long as the float is there, you can stand. The moment the projection goes away, you need to pull yourself up. In the lab, it actually works quite nicely, so they figured out, could this be a public health intervention? And they put prototypes of this in a tram in Melbourne, and they found that people wouldn't use them. And then good empirical research that they went out and asked people why they wouldn't use them. And apart from the security issues, they say, well, because this is silly and I would embarrass myself if I do that. Which is a problem, right? It's an actual real design problem. But at the other hand, it opens up an interesting theoretical conundrum because on the other hand, adults find this kind of stuff embarrassing. Not kids. Kids are happy, but adults have this embarrassment issue. On the other hand, we see that sometimes adults do play quite unashamedly, like in the Global No Pants Day, or when they're playing with their kids. So why is that? Why is it that in certain situations adults are ashamed or embarrassed to play in public, and why in other situations they feel they have the license to do so? What are the underlying psychological and sociological mechanisms that we as designers might make use of? So I wrote a paper about that, Alibis for Adult Play, where I basically discovered that my license was helpful for me to really poach all the fields that there are. So reading Brené Brown on shame resilience, which is in social work, Goffman on face work, which is microsociological, alibis in law, or Granoff on threshold effects, which is macrosociological, honeypot effects in HCI, psychology on embarrassment, philosophy of play, game studies on play alibis, and then educational research on people's conceptions of adulthood and adult responsibilities, all of which made sense and added together to a kind of mid-level theory of alibis of adult play. I won't spoil the results. If you're interested in the results, it's an open access paper. Content warning, there are pictures of barely clad bearded men playing Twister. But I noticed that this license to poach gave me this ability to do this kind of theorizing, which with other people in other disciplines I've rarely encountered. And this poaching, kind of another systematic side effect of that, the second lesson was code switching. So if you're not familiar with code switching, this is one of kind of the famous examples people use. So this is Barack Obama visiting the Team USA basketball team before a match against Brazil in 2013. And as you see in the picture, so in one moment, he's greeting a white guy with a very typical white handshake, and then he switches when he's meeting Kevin Durant, the basketball player, with a very different, very black handshake and a greeting. So code switching practically describes this in the flow of communication or expressing, shifting from one register or one language fluidly to another. Because you're multilingual, you're polyglot, you actually have the ability to do that, to switch to the code that is fitting to your audience or the person that you're interacting with. You could also call this framing or reframing messages to different audiences. And I found that by virtue of poaching, by virtue of trying to make sense of different kinds of contexts around a particular text like Jorge Luis Borges, or by virtue of doing this kind of alibis of adult play, you acquired the necessary ability to rapidly switch codes, to read text, make sense of them, understand how does this particular discipline or this particular field frame and parse the world to particular kinds of language. How can I work myself quickly into that? And in my sense making across that in my own text, how can I switch and explain between these different registers very, very fluidly? And I would argue that there is no practical skill in my own day-to-day work right now that I rely on more and that I find more responsible, I would argue, for whatever success I've had. No matter if it's public speaking, I've done lots of public speaking, or networking, right? Knowing your audience. Am I speaking to designers? Am I speaking to teachers? Am I speaking to educational researchers? Am I speaking to executives? The things they care about, the language they use to express the things they care about. Understanding that, knowing that, and being able to express your point in their language is just good public speaking. It's good communicating. Similarly, if I collaborate with colleagues across disciplines, so in computer science, for instance, if you're standing on the whiteboard and you try to design a study together, the ability to understand to some extent how they're making sense of the world and how they're working through problems and what the words they approximately mean, and how can use their language to approximately get my point across to them is a crucial collaboration skill. Or in the case of grant funding or actually writing any kind of paper, knowing the audience you're talking about, what discipline, what reviewer council, what have you, are you talking to, what do they care about, what language or code do they use that I need to use in order to get my point across. Combined with that, the third lesson, that is sort of another side effect, is pattern spotting. So as you switch registers, as you poach and as you read wildly across kind of different areas, you cannot help but notice patterns, similarities, right? Formal similarities or concept-wise similarities, which arguably is the one thing that I would say comparative literature actually formally teaches you, this kind of hunting of tropes or genres or conventions across art history or across literatures and see how things compare and how they shape and how they stay the same. Gustav René Hocke's The World is Labyrinth, one of my favorite examples. The details are wrong and long disproven, but anyhow, as a kind of exercise of going through art history and showing that there is a kind of sinus curve between Atticism and Asianism, or you could kind of say between mannerism and minimalism, sort of, right? You love flourish and detail and exuberance, and then you go back to something very strict, minimalist, reduced. How you can trace this kind of sinus curve all through art history is an example for this way of squinting at the world in order to see the high-level pattern underlying all these different forms of expression. Which is something I found surprisingly useful the days that I now do qualitative research, where effectively you do the same thing, right? You interview lots of people, for instance, and then try, with computer-aided support, try to make sense of the data, all of that interviews, and say, what are they saying? What are the joint themes? Where do they disagree with each other, and why? And what is the model or the grounded theory that you can develop out of that? So I'm not saying, again, this is a humanities unique skill, but it's definitely one that I found when I'm now doing qualitative research, actually I draw on and I find myself quite capable to do. Or, again, dealing with a topic like applied and serious games as I do, and then talking with lots of different researchers in lots of different fields like economics, like design, about the very same topic, being able to take a step back, as I did in a chapter in this edited book together with a colleague, and say, okay, you notice that there are actually, when people talk about applied or serious games, 7 or 8 different rhetorics or discourses, how they make sense of it. And depending which rhetoric you come from and how you look at this phenomenon through your language, you can very well talk past somebody completely different as a result of that. And sort of having this one step back in order to be able to see these rhetorics as rhetorics and then being able to register shift between them, again, is super useful if you're working in any kind of applied field. So, I could list more things than textual poaching and pattern spotting and code switching, like the beautiful power that is in finding sources and identifying sources and knowing the actual source text in full, like even in university policy, right? Knowing the actual policy document in detail, super useful in any context. So hunting that down instead of trusting hearsay, great skill. or seeing the rhetoric form in anything, or being able to see the cultural and historical contingency in whatever phenomenon is thrown at you, critiquing arguments, composing text. All of these are things that I would argue I draw upon day to day. But interestingly, I actually pulled my old transcripts out back from Münster. If I compare this list with this list, which is my transcript, they appear nowhere in my transcript. Right? History of world literature, poetics, cyborgs in literature, James Joyce Dubliners. None of this is how to see the rhetoric form in everything or how to critique arguments. For instance, so this is a phenomenon that educators, educational researchers call the hidden curriculum, right? They point out that the thing that we formally explicitly teach usually is subject matter content is one thing, that in parallel to that or underlying that, there are a lot of things that we don't explicitly talk or think about or design for, but that students still take away by accident, by implication, or by perniciousness of the system that we design. So one thing we all learn from schooling is how to sit down, not speak, and listen to a person in a situation of social status for extended periods of time, and to find that thing completely normal and acceptable. Last time I sat through a conference again from 9 to 5, I went, yeah, this is a skill, and I completely unlearned it because I'm just incapable of doing this anymore. I don't know how the students do it, but back then I could. So these kinds of hidden curricula, they're usually dealing with more tacit, habitual, pragmatic, and material things than the content, the explicit subject matter. And they're usually far more long-term influential than any of the subject matter. But weirdly, we deal less with it, usually, and pay, by definition, it's hidden, far less attention to it than to the subject matter, right? So compare how much we praise composition as a skill that doing a humanities degree teaches you versus the amount of actual time that we spend deliberately practicing composition with students. Apart from just grading their papers on whether they nailed it or not, but we usually just have one, at least back in Münster, we had one propedeutic seminar that was about how to compose your academic text, but not composing it for different audiences and not deliberate practice across 4 years. You either got it or you didn't get it. So I started with a confession, and that's sort of the confrontation I would like to end with. What if we took these kind of hidden curricula that are actually potentially valuable apart from the subject matter in humanities curricula, if we want people to look back fondly at their experience, and make these skills the explicit subject matter of our curricula. There are examples for that I've seen. For instance, Calling Bullshit, lovely seminar by Carl Bergstrom and Kevin West, where they basically teach you how to take apart rubbish arguments around data in day-to-day public life. Or if you take the things that I suggested, for instance, an advanced Google Scholar seminar about how to poach any field and speak its codes in 24 hours, if you want to be able to pass as an economist tomorrow. Thank you.
So you can say a little more about, you didn't quite use the words imposter syndrome, but at one point I thought you were going to, when you either re-entering a field you've left or entering a new field. This has been a lot of talk about interdisciplinarity today, and I absolutely know what that means. The imposter syndrome, rather. Any tips for the sort of confidence, when you're talking about a sort of academic confidence, any tips for, you've clearly overcome some of those hurdles for those of us who need more academic confidence in moving into areas where, yeah, we've got something to say, but the rules of the game tells us that we should stay in our little silos of training.
Yeah. So that's definitely a systematic side effect of any kind of multi or interdisciplinary work, that you move into the new field and you go, oh my God, what's going on here? And you definitely feel underprepared, and you don't feel like, what right do I have to teach? What right do I have to talk in that context? So I think the first answer to that for easing in is collaborating with other people in the field. So constructing a discourse and understanding the other field by talking with somebody who basically says, yeah, I think you're a nice person, and in general I believe you have a sharp hat on your shoulders, so therefore let's do this together. And I do most of the reframing work at the beginning, and then if we write the same results up for your discipline, you do most of the framing work. So this kind of collaboration usually makes the most sense. The second step that I found is again that weirdly reading science studies, philosophy of science, history of science, is a great tool. For that, because it gives you that meta perspective across all kinds of different disciplines and gives you a language to talk about, okay, this is how you, a very formal computer science discipline, does this. This is how we do it. These are our epistemological differences. I've had language for phrasing and parsing that, and for phrasing the kind of blind spots of either side. So I find that another useful tool.
Yeah, I think that's a very wise comment, actually. Very, be good to talk afterwards. Thanks.